Hi there. I've been asked to remind you to fill out your feedback forms when you're finished. And as this talk is about her story, note that rather than saying haphazard or disorganized, the phrase is non-linear. So I'm Sam Barlow, and I'm here talking to you because I made this game, Her Story. Her Story is a game I put out last year, in June of last year, for mobile, PC, and Mac. And I've kind of assumed that most of you will either have played it or kind of have a rough idea of how the game plays. So can anyone put their hand up if they haven't played the game or know anything about it whatsoever? So we're good. We're good. We can move on. So Her Story was a big success for me. I got Polygon Game of the Year, lots of other nice awards. It's been a big commercial success. And the true success for me was that I still get these lovely pictures from people who've played the game, sending me the notes that they wrote when they were playing the game and giving me this real sense of kind of their personal engagement with the game. I still get these, like every day I'll get one or two of these people sending through, so that's really great. And Her Story was, for me, in many ways, quite an experimental game, so it's quite cool that I'm here at GDC talking about it to other game designers and other game writers, because it was kind of an attempt by me to push something in a very extreme direction, to kind of prove a point to myself or disprove it if it didn't work. And getting stuff like this through from players kind of reinforces my belief that some of the directions I was pushing were quite fruitful. Her Story feels as well like kind of the culmination of all the games I've made. So there's a list here. These are the good games I've made. There were some really bad ones in between, but we can kind of skip those. There's like 10 years between Isle and Silent Hill Shattered Memories that was very fruitful in learning my craft. With all these games, I kind of felt like I was pushing to tell personal stories, stories that were very kind of grounded in reality, would have characters with some kind of psychological depth, but would also allow players who are playing these games to have a heightened kind of personal sense of connection and engagement to the work. And I guess what I learned when the last one, Legacy of Kain Dead Son, was cancelled was that trying to make this kind of game for lots of money for a big console publisher was probably going to get more and more tricky as time went on. And so kind of with the cancellation of Dead Son, there was a point where I decided to become an independent developer. And that was the point where I took a kind of step back and forced myself to kind of think, what is it about interactive storytelling that's actually exciting me? Why am I doing this? What things about interactive storytelling feel special to me beyond any other media that's out there? But also to think quite hard, partly out of being pragmatic as an independent developer, but also as an exercise, to think about what is the stuff that I just do because it feels like it's part of the template of making a video game. What are the assumptions that I've made over 15, 16 years of being a game designer that actually I can kind of throw away? And when I made Silent Hill Shattered Memories, we tried as a team to start with a blank page and ask ourselves, what would a horror game look like if we'd never seen any other horror games? But there was still a lot of baggage there. There was a lot of expectations, especially with the franchise. So this was an opportunity to really step back and decide for myself what mattered most to me about interactive storytelling. And then, like I say, in the spirit of an experimental project, try and push that as far as I could. And that led to me writing really pretentious things like this in my notebook. This being GDC, I'll share this here, but no one else should see this. So I can't remember when I wrote this, and because it was actually in a real physical notebook, there's no date stamp on it or anything. I will go deep on story, explore authentic and true characters. For my first trick, you see, it was very pretentious. I will make a game with no meaningful state change, a game without presence, and a game about subtext. So those first two things, I had this kind of suspicion that there is a lot of stuff that we include in video games that is awesome and is unique to the medium of video games. And because it's unique to video games, it kind of feels like it's the important thing. It's the thing we should be focusing on if we're trying to tell stories with a video game. But I had this kind of suspicion that maybe sometimes we lean on that stuff as a prop, and it gives us lots of stuff for free, but does it necessarily engage with the storytelling and what's going on there? So I was trying to push myself to kind of throw some of that stuff out and see what I was left with. And a big part of that was the subtext, was this idea of subtext. So every storytelling medium out there relies on subtext. Subtext is kind of the heart of a lot of storytelling. But it's something we really struggle with in video games, and especially on my kind of last few projects where I'd been using kind of performance capture and high-end CGI. There was always this tension where we were trying to write lines of dialogue for the characters and spend a lot of time in rehearsal with the actors to have that performance and that subtext come through. And people were always very skeptical if that was something that we could or should be doing within video games, within CGI. So I really wanted to push that as something, trying to really make a point that we could not only have a game which involved subtext, but potentially have a game which revolved around subtext. So this is an overview of kind of where my head was. Like I said, I kind of stepped back and tried to think quite hard about what excited me about interactive storytelling. And I was thinking just about storytelling in general. What matters to me about storytelling? And this concept of the reality factor is something that I kind of got quite into. All stories are judged on how real they feel. This is like a statement that I'm not going to give you any evidence to back it up, but it feels like a real truth to me. And when I say real, I'm not talking necessarily about things being realistic or having kind of authentic details, but the extent to which, when we're engaged with a story, how much do we believe in it? Are we genuinely worried for the fate of the characters? Do we genuinely react emotionally when something bad happens to these characters? To what extent is our mind engaged in the ongoing story and kind of thinking around it, worrying around it? That's the kind of reality I'm talking about. And for me, this seems like the intrinsic kind of value judgment when we enjoy a story. Is, did I really kind of mesh with this story? Did its events feel real to me? And so I was thinking about, how do stories create this reality factor? How do stories make themselves feel real to us? And really, for me, the best simulation tech we have is the imagination. We have these brains that are designed to help us survive, and there's all sorts of hard-coded, weird simulation tech in there that does nothing but try and convince us that stuff that isn't happening is really happening and is really important. So the example is, when we are slightly hairier mammals and we're wandering around and we're in some tall grass and the grass moves because the wind's blown it, it's our imagination's job to convince us that there's a snake there. That wasn't the wind, it was a snake, and it's going to kill you, and you should treat that really seriously. So there's all this lovely programming that is there to take imagined, invented things and invest them with this kind of real sense of importance and weight. And I think all good storytelling finds ways to hijack this kind of simulation tech that our brains have and use that to help tell the story. And when I started thinking more about interactivity and how that meshes with the imagination, the thing that became really clear to me was thinking about traditional storytelling was just how intrinsic interactivity is to any storytelling. And I'm not just talking about kind of the idea of sitting around a campfire and kind of the oral tradition of storytelling. So for example, if you're sat watching a movie, you're sat in the dark and you're looking at the screen and there's a character on screen and you're invested in what that character's doing, and you're probably desiring some kind of outcome and you want to see that outcome vicariously acted out through this protagonist on screen. So maybe you want the handsome couple to get together, or you want the protagonist to go kill the bad guy. And as you're watching this story on the screen, you're willing the character to do something. You're thinking through in your brain what's going to happen, what are the potential outcomes, what's going to happen next, and you're willing the character to act in a certain way. And then when that character does something on the screen, if this film has been well constructed, there's a good chance the character is going to do the thing you were willing them to do. And then there's going to be unintended consequences. And then straight away you have this sense of involvement, of complicity, and there's maybe even feelings of guilt. You wanted the character to go do this thing, the character did it, and now this really bad thing happened that you weren't expecting. And so you're drawn even further into it, because your imagination, it's running all these simulations in your head, it's taking this stuff seriously. And when things that are unexpected happen, that kind of pushes it into overdrive, and it makes it really engage with making these things feel even more real. So something that I was very focused on was not pretending that interactivity was this new thing that only games can deliver on. It's a very special, unique thing, but it was thinking about how have traditional storytellers used interactivity, or at least the impression of interactivity, and how can I kind of embellish that? How can we actually, by having a genuine dialogue with the player through a digital interactive story, how can we actually build on that? So I was thinking about, if you think of novels and short story writing, as Hemingway popularized this idea of the iceberg principle. The idea there is that as a writer, Hemingway is the god of his story world. He knows all the events, he knows all the characters, he knows what's going on in their heads, he has everything down in wonderful, extravagant detail. But when it comes to actually writing this on the page, he only writes the very surface level. As he calls it, it's the 1/8 of the iceberg that's above the water. And so when the audience comes to this work and they read it, they're actually doing the hard lifting. They're doing all this work to summon up and imagine the rest of the iceberg under the water. And this creates a much more powerful story. This creates a story which in the player's or the audience's mind feels real because they've summoned it up. Their imagination is working to make that feel real to them. Obviously in the written word, the use of the imagination is kind of a given, but this extends for me to all storytelling. So the best example for me that really got me thinking about this was if you look at cinema. So in cinema, you have this medium which is built around the idea of a machine that captures a visual record of an action or an event. That's what the medium is. That's what a film camera is. And so the very first film, and this is its UK title, Train Pulling Into a Station, is a movie of a train pulling into a station. And that's it. It's this visual record of this event that occurred. But then if you look at cinema and you look how it evolved into an art form and into a storytelling medium, it's fascinating because the real craft of telling a story on the screen isn't about what you show. It's not about what you record on your camera, but it's about what you don't show. So if you look at the tools of modern cinema and you look at things like the cut, the magic that occurs when you jump from one image to another and leave something in between. When you look at montages, you look at a character walks into a room and you see their expression, but you don't see what they're looking at. Or another character shuffles in and you just see their feet, but you don't see their body. It's all about leveraging the imagination, engaging the imagination by not showing things. So this was a big deal for me, thinking about having a medium which is predicated on this idea of capturing a visual record of things. But when it comes to telling a story in this medium, the art is in not showing things. That got me thinking again about video games. So this is my slide where I kind of bitch about video games a bit. Mainly about the kind of the popular idea of a 3D action-adventure video game as it stands now. So if I'm focused on thinking about the reality factor being the most important thing in a story, this sense of it feeling real, surely video games are an awesome place to be because the whole medium is about creating these virtual realities that are very responsive and reactive to what players do. But I had these kind of suspicions and these concerns. So I worried, is 3D space, is the exploration of 3D space just this red herring? Working on stuff like the Silent Hill games, I knew that it's very easy to drop the player into an atmospheric, spooky, dark, empty town, give them a flashlight, and instantly they're going to feel kind of involved and immersed. There's an amount of excitement around that. But I was worried that it's maybe too easy to do that. What are we actually achieving storytelling-wise by doing this? And then thinking more about the kind of the modern video game is obsessed with continuous time, contiguous space. I can walk from A to B and see everything in between. I can turn around 360 degrees. I can see everything in incredible detail. And there's that kind of gag about movies where people joke that you never see protagonists going to the toilet. But in games, pretty much every big AAA game, you can go into any toilet you want. You can go up, you can flush them, you can wash your hands, you can use the hand dryers, you can open all the cubicles. But we just go to town on allowing you to screw around with that toilet stuff. And as much as that's like a cool novelty and we love it and we expect it of our games, like if I played a big action-adventure now and I couldn't go into the toilet, so I'd be kind of annoyed. I was questioning, is this serving the storytelling? Because it seems like we're taking more and more away from the imagination. We're giving you everything. We're not asking you to imagine things. And this extends to the storytelling as well. If you have a video game in which the protagonist is the main character of your story, and if you have this idea that the player should be doing everything for the protagonist, then in any given story, all the story beats are happening on screen, and they're actually being directly controlled by the player character. By the player, and so you're removing some of the kind of questions around the story. You're removing some of the intent and the motivation that these characters have inside their head. And so it feels like we're just having less and less of a role for the imagination to play. And there's further problems with this idea as the player, as the protagonist, where, and I've bumped into this so many times, if your story is also kind of the delivery mechanism for your mission objectives and the quest that your character is on, there's this tension there where you're looking at it as a user experience. And so you're trying to create these characters and have them speak with a good degree of subtext and kind of make this really authentic and sticking everything below the water, so it's this hidden iceberg. But then, for example, say your main character has to go kill a dragon. So she's sat at a table and her sister comes in. In a video game, she's probably going to say, hey, you should go kill that dragon. If you're writing that for the screen, you'd probably have it play out that they're sat at the table and she asks her sister, can you pass the salt? And the sister kind of pushes it over in a passive-aggressive way, and the subtext is like, for fuck's sake, just go kill that dragon already. And you would try and craft it and create it in such a way that the audience is kind of extracting this information. But there's a real risk if that's actually your mission objective that the player might not pick up the subtext. There's this kind of tension, which I find very detrimental to trying to tell an interesting story. There are some great exceptions, though. So 30 Flights of Loving is fantastic, and I love this thing so much. And, this is a game that does use 3D space, does give you that sense of involvement of being in a 3D space, but it also does some really great things by omitting dialogue, by having this stylized look, and doing these wonderful things with cutting time and space. This actually does a really great job of giving you this interactive 3D experience that is still leveraging and engaging the imagination. I'm still staggered to this day that more games haven't ripped off 30 Flights of Loving. So there's a tip. So this was kind of where my head was at. I was very skeptical about all these things that I'd been making before and these things that I was kind of in love with. Like as a teenager, I was the biggest Looking Glass fan and was totally into the kind of immersive sim thing. And so my vision of the future of video game storytelling was very much this kind of immersive, contiguous 3D world thing. But at this point, I was taking a step back and just thinking about what mattered to me in terms of storytelling. And so Her Story became very much, in its initial conception, a kind of test bed for these ideas. Can I push things as an extreme direction as possible? Can I put as much as possible onto the weight of the player's imagination and pull as much out of the actual game so that everything is being done in the player's head? And this kind of resulted in a series of mechanics that did this in many different ways. So if you look at someone playing Her Story, you have this jeopardy element. So whenever you look at a given clip, you're only seeing the answer to a question. So straight away, the brain is set to work on trying to figure out, well, what was the question being asked? You have to infer the context, and kind of as a bigger picture, you're inferring the line of questioning that's going on. Then we have my favorite subtext. So you have a character who's sat in this police interview room who doesn't necessarily want to tell the truth to the police. In some cases, she doesn't actually know how to tell the truth. And she's also speaking in a kind of terse, naturalistic way. So in any given clip, you have the surface level of what's actually being spoken, but you're being asked to use your emotional intelligence to understand the subtext, to figure out what's actually going on under the surface. And obviously that leans a lot on the use of film performance, because through the actress Viva Seifert, you're able to kind of get much more of that information compressed into the performance. And obviously the game is structured in a way which is very disordered. Your experience of Her Story is probably almost like finding a kind of video jigsaw with lots of small pieces spread around the floor. So you're finding these little pieces, these little clips of information, and you're having to put it together in your head. So you're joining the gaps, you're imagining the bits you haven't seen, you're seeing one clip, and then there's another clip from earlier. Now that you're seeing this new context and things are sparking, and your imagination is just really crunching, working overtime on trying to figure out this thing and put all the pieces together. And then the last thing is this really important to me is genre. So I think it's probably true to say that the audience that we have today is probably the most story-literate audience that's ever existed in the history of humanity. By the time you reach adulthood, you'll have seen so many stories via TV, adverts, newspapers, books, comics, games. You will have seen every possible combination of plot and character. If you were talking specifically about the murder mystery or police procedural space, you will have seen every possible twist or type of crime that you could possibly imagine. And so if you're writing for linear storytelling, if you're writing for the TV or for a book, then you have this really difficult job because the audience has seen it all. And so trying to come up with something fresh is really, really difficult. But this is like a fantastic tool for us working in the interactive space. Because if you have this audience that knows genre intuitively, even if they're not even aware of it, then they have this whole toolkit. They know the rules, they know the tropes of the genre. So if we're in this position like I was with Her Story, where I'm trying to remove things from putting it on screen, remove stuff from the content and have them put it back in with their imagination, well, then they have this fantastic tool set. So by working within genre, working within established genres, you're engaging the audience much more in imagining how the story unfolds, and you're kind of leveraging that toolkit. then there's these things that I call hacking the imagination. And this is like an approach I have towards the idea of immersion and engagement, which is, it's kind of tantric, a tantric approach to immersion, I think, where if you have a player who's deeply engaged in your story, if their imagination is engaged in making this story real, then I found there's a thing you can do where if you push back against that immersion, if you push back against their engagement, then there's this kind of Newtonian reaction where the imagination, which is trying so hard to make this thing real, will push back with you and will engage even harder to try and make this real. Because it's so critical to the imagination that the brain is believing all this stuff that the imagination is conjuring up. So one way of doing this is twists. And I know that traditionally, if a video game has a single good twist, then that's like a really cool thing. But ideally, you have lots and lots of twists, and we can kind of layer them up. And twists are fantastic because if you drop a big revelation into your story, if you drop a twist in, you're essentially rebooting the simulation. Everything that came before is now going to be seen in a new light. And so you have this thing where the imagination that's trying so hard to convince you this stuff is real is suddenly like, oh shit, quickly change everything, and kind of reboots the simulation, and now is scurrying to get things up and running again and is trying twice as hard to convince you that it's real. So you can keep kind of throwing twists in, and again, it just adds to the level of engagement and adds to the extent to which the imagination is pushing these things. And there are lots of other little twists you can do to try and push and create this level of distance between the player and their immersion in the game. So in her story, you have this concept that, on one hand, is very immersive, this idea that the device you're playing on is a screen. In the fiction, you're looking at a screen, so there's very little distance between you and this fictitious world. But then what I do is I throw in this layer of the screen reflection. And the screen reflection is reflecting a room that you are not in. It's reflecting a police basement with some strip lighting, which is probably not where you're playing the game. And so this is like a very subtle, just little thing that's there, just kind of giving you these gentle little love taps, kind of pushing you back, and then your imagination can kind of push back. And at certain points in the game, the more emotive points of the game, we push this further, and there's kind of a light flicker or a police car goes past, and you see a much more obvious reflection of the character on the screen. And again, this is not you. This is the character in the story. And again, this is just like a nice way of just pushing back and forcing your imagination to kind of engage further. And it also leads me on to something that is really important to me when I think about story. And that's this idea that all stories need a frame. For me, at the very core level, what is a story? A story is this mechanism by which we can have people simultaneously experience an emotional moment, but also kind of intellectualize it, also kind of have a layer of thought on top of this. And in real life, we don't work like this. In real life, you're going to react emotionally in the moment and then later think about it, or you're going to be thinking about something and not necessarily reacting emotionally. And story is this incredible mechanism we have for enabling these things to happen simultaneously. And we do this through having these characters in our stories that you are engaging with, and you are empathizing with them, and you're living through their experience vicariously. And so when these emotional things happen to these characters in a story, you experience all of that emotion, but you have enough distance, because it's a character on a screen or on a page, you have enough distance that you're also able to kind of apply that to your own life, or think about the greater thematic picture, or how this relates to the kind of the overarching arc of the story. And this, for me, is like the core magic of storytelling. This is, I think, what people get out of storytelling. And so it's very important for me that when creating a story, we don't think in terms of absolute immersion. So I have a level of skepticism, and it's probably the wrong GDC to say this, about kind of the end goal of VR and this idea that people have of the holodeck as being kind of the ultimate storytelling experience. Like I say, I think the younger me would have loved that. But for me, this idea of the holodeck, where you would be immersed entirely in the world of the story, surrounded on all sides by the story, I can't imagine how I would have this kind of story experience there. It would feel like, I don't know, it's like a fake reality or something. It's not going to have this wonderful layering of this simultaneous emotion and thought that you get in a kind of story. So it's very important for me to add this distance in there. I didn't realize that was going to get a clap. That wasn't what I was expecting. So this was kind of where my head was at and what I was trying to do with her story. And then how did I actually go about it? So as much as the actual game itself was trying to do something somewhat unconventional and extreme, I wanted to do the same with the development itself. So what I did was, up front, I spent 6 months, which was just under half of the development time, working on just research. So this was not actually engaged in doing anything, making anything. It was just going away and reading manuals on interrogation techniques from the police, reading academic books about police interrogation, novels, watching all my favorite police procedural shows, watching tens of hours of video of real-life interrogations, just really immersing myself in stuff. And as much as the game is about empowering the imagination of the player, this is a way for me of empowering my imagination. If you just put all this stuff in your head, naturally things are going to spark off each other. Ideas that you would never have put together are going to get put together, and you're going to discover new things and interesting things that you wouldn't have otherwise. So this was a really important part of the process for me. And there's a few little examples here of how this played out in reality. I'm going to start this playing. So there's the case of Jodi Arias. This is a real case, a very tragic case of a woman who murdered her boyfriend, and it was played big in the media. And all of her interrogation tapes were uploaded to YouTube so people can go and see it and watch them and write inane comments on YouTube and think that they're kind of judge and jury, and it's all horrendous. And I went and I watched lots of these, and just to give you a quick idea, this is how this stuff played in the media.
Accused of murder, but Jodi Arias has never been seen publicly like this before. In the video you're watching, and more that you're about to see,
So they took these tens and tens of hours of interrogation footage, and they would pick out the bits where she was doing something slightly more interesting or strange, and then they added their kind of media narrative to this. So she became the blonde bombshell, she became the ice queen, the femme fatale, all these kind of narratives. But for me, I sat and I spent a week just watching these videos in real time, watching this interrogation unfold, and I found this interesting thing was happening. Initially, when I started the project, I had been in the position of being the detective. Like, for me, that was the fantasy. I want to be a police detective. This is the game that's going to explore what that feels like. But as I sat and watched all these videos of Jodi, very quickly my perspective shifted, and I was empathizing a huge amount with her and thinking about what is it like to be the person in this chair. And then in particular, I was looking into the concept of women who murder. And statistically, it's something like 1 in 10 murders is done by a woman. So it's kind of, a statistical anomaly, and questioning what does that say about our society and where the power balance lies. Looking into other similar cases and how those cases were kind of reported and the narrative put around them. And it just sent me off thinking about all sorts of things. I was thinking about generations of women in my family, and I did a bit of research into that, and kind of thinking about their stories and the roles they had to play. And it really kind of steered the direction of the project to the point where I was thinking about how do I reframe this narrative so it becomes about the woman sat in the chair and her story. And this led to the idea of removing the police narrative entirely, not even giving the police a voice, having them out of the experience. And this idea of using the keywords, using the words that the character speaks as this kind of breadcrumb trail to explore the story, kind of felt like it was a way of putting the power back into the woman's hands, giving her story back to her. So this was hugely instructive. On a slightly more ridiculous level, I went and watched Basic Instinct because, this has a famous police interrogation and plays to all these kind of ideas of the kind of female murderer. But when I watched it, I discovered on the DVD they had all this video of the casting stuff that Sharon Stone had done with the director. And this stuff blew me away because it's all shot with these kind of slightly awkward framing. There's no costume, lighting. It's devoid of the kind of glamour and the kind of cinematic pizzazz. And watching this stuff, I found it so much more involving and engaging and authentic feeling than the actual movie versions. And that really got me thinking about this kind of idea of pushing something in a found footage direction. It planted interesting little seeds, like you have the director, Paul Verhoeven, is off screen reading the police dialogue. So that kind of really embellished that idea for me of having the police out of the picture. So unexpected things like this kind of pop out. I went back and I reread lots of J.G. Ballard's short stories because he does lots of interesting thematic experiments. Like he wrote a story that is told through the index to a fictional autobiography. He had a short story that was a series of answers to a fictional questionnaire, and you don't ever see the questions. And I discovered his introduction to the Atrocity exhibition, which for me sealed exactly what I was trying to nail. I think I've probably got enough time to read this out to you. I'll read it quickly. Readers who find themselves daunted by the unfamiliar narrative structure of the Atrocity exhibition, far simpler than it seems at first glance, might try a different approach. Rather than start at the beginning of each chapter, as in a conventional novel, simply turn the pages until a paragraph catches your eye. If the ideas or images seem interesting, scan the nearby paragraphs for anything that resonates in an intriguing way. Fairly soon, I hope, the fog will clear and the underlying narrative will reveal itself. In effect, you will be reading the book in the way it was written. This blew me away when I read this because this idea of kind of surfing a story driven by the player's curiosity towards themes or words and that creating the spine of the story was exactly what I was trying to nail. And then this kind of closing piece where he talks about the fact that the author and the reader are kind of in parity. They're both approaching this from the same position. And that was something that really spoke to me and was something that I felt was happening around how I was developing her story. When I first started, actually, the job of creating the game, after the research was done, and I was like, right, this is kind of what I'm going to be making, and I had a rough idea. I had it in my head that there were going to be tons of flowcharts. I was going to have to create this big diagram of all the different ways that things could unfold and kind of crack this like a puzzle. This was kind of my level designer kind of baggage coming with me. But then I went away and I made this prototype. I found a real-life transcript from this guy, Porco, who killed his parents, and I stuck it into a Google sheet, ripped out all the police questions, and then started playing it as if it was a game of Her Story. And very quickly I was kind of delighted because this kid was really good. He didn't give the game away. He didn't confess. He didn't kind of incriminate himself. But if you played it with the Her Story mechanic, if you started searching for keywords, you discovered this connection, this theme running throughout, and words like money would expose that whatever question he was answered, he would always come back to questions of money and finances. And then I read that this guy had killed his parents to get the inheritance money from them. And it kind of clicked for me. It was an intoxicating experience navigating a story in this way. And that's the point where I realized if I can just create a story and layers of story that are as rich as this Porco case, if I can have the characters speak in a way which is terse and naturalistic, then I can probably give players that same experience I've had. And that sent me off working in a very organic way, writing kind of from the inside out. I think we're coming to a close here, so I'm going to speed through these. So what I did was I did all this research. I sat down, I wrote lots of documents, biographies, kind of bits and pieces about the characters, really got inside their head to the point where the characters were just desperate to speak. And then I sat down and I just wrote out the 7 interviews in a kind of very performative way. Had the characters just speaking to each other and tried to get it to come out as naturalistically as it would. And that's when I engaged the computer. So I then stuck it in this giant spreadsheet and used that to kind of break down word use. Like these clips are densely connected through using the same words. This synonym is not used much, so this not as well balanced. And the computer would basically highlight clips for me where there were problems with the word use or the level of connectivity, and I would go in, kind of tweak those, step back. So it was this very kind of sculptural experience of stepping back, seeing what needed to be tweaked, going in, chiseling a little bit off. And that was a very exciting kind of organic way of developing a story for me. So, conclusions. As I say, when I started out on Her Story, for me it was about proving that the more we engage with the players' imaginations, then the more personally involved they're going to be, and the more engaged they're going to be with the story. And I think that kind of proved itself. But it also revealed to me that it was as much about that as it was about empowering my imagination or your imagination as a game designer or writer. And thinking back on the games that I've made, that I'm proud of, Isle, Shattered Memories, Her Story, these were all games that were strongly player-driven, but they were also strongly authored. And trying to establish in my head, trying to identify what made that happen was that in all those cases, there were kind of mechanics in the game, or there was a structure within the game that kind of gave me this framework where, as an author, as I'm writing this, I'm kind of in a similar point of view as the player. So as much as I'm exploring and discovering the story, the player is later going to discover it and explore it in the same way. So I found myself in a position where I was writing organically from the inside out of the experience, which I think gives things a real edge. That's how you create interesting, rich stories that people are going to respond to personally. So my message to you is to encourage you to search out new mechanics, new game structures, which allow you to do this. Try and figure out ways of telling stories interactively where your experience as a writer is going to somehow marry with that of the player at the end of the day, and allow you to kind of create this collaborative experience where as much work is happening in the player's imagination as it does in yours. And that is the end from me.